Um, Thanks for joining us today in this LinkedIn Live organized by the Association of Project Management, APM, where we will be discussing how project professionals create a fair work environment. I'm Gabriela Ramirez Rivas. I'm APM's Research and Impact Advisor. I'm in charge of running the academic research program, which aims to advance new and existing knowledge and project management. Research sits in the Policy and Public Affairs team at APM, and all three parts link together. Our research, like Christine's here, fits into APM's policy development and positioning, and Public Affairs then takes that policy, that evidence, and promotes it to politicians, to key stakeholders, and others. We're focused on ensuring project management research directly influences and impacts on government policy development. So today's conversation centers on the research study Fairness and Unfairness in Projects, a study conducted by Dr. Christine Unterhitzenberger and Dr. Kate Lawrence, which you can find at APM's research website. Joining me today is Christine. She's an associate professor of project management at the University of Leeds, director of the Leeds Centre for Project Management, and a chartered project professional. She has taught project management and research methods on different under- and postgraduate levels. She has also developed and delivered project management courses for executive education and is a regular speaker at industry events. And while her research is focused on behavioral and organizational aspects in projects. Welcome, Christine. Thanks for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you here. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. Of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them and we will try to answer them in the last part of our session. So yeah, welcome everybody. And without further ado, I give the floor to you, Christine. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Gabriela, and thank you for having me, and welcome everyone to our LinkedIn Live. Yeah, it is my pleasure today to introduce you to our research on fairness and unfairness in projects and how project professionals can create a fairer working environment. If we could have the slides, please. Perfect. So Gabriela has already given a brief introduction about myself. I'm the director of the Leeds Centre for Projects and an associate professor in project management at the University of Leeds. I've also got a long history of working with the APM. I am the former chair of the Research Advisory Group and also a former member of the Professional Standards and Knowledge Committee. I'm an editor of the Project Management Journal, which is one of the academic journals in our field, and also a member of the Studies and Knowledge Committee of the Major Projects Association. And a few years ago, I have founded, together with the honorary fellow of APM, Professor Naomi Brooks, the Project Experiences SIG at the British Academy of Management. So that is a learned society for management scholars. It's called British Academy, but about 50% of its members are actually international. And we founded the project management community there. And before I moved into academia, I worked for about 10 years in industry. And as Gabriela said, I'm also a chartered project professional based on this experience. Sorry, I've also got my cat here who's just decided to move. I did this research that I'm going to talk about today with Dr. Kate Lawrence, who you can also see on the slides here. She was our postdoctoral research fellow on this project. And the structure of today is going to be that I talk for about 10 minutes about a fairer working environment in projects. And then Gabriela and I are going to have a little bit of a discussion on some questions, and then we have an open Q&A. And I would like to start with this quote by Charles Sykes. Life is not fair, get used to it. Probably many of us have heard this quote or have heard something similar, or maybe have thought something similar when they experienced maybe a situation which they perceived as not being fair, and that's something that we need to get used to and that we need to deal with. However, we would like to challenge that, because we know from research that if we have a fairer work environment, we will get better results, and it has an impact on the health and well-being of people. And often, fairer working environment isn't necessarily what we associate with it in the first instance. For example, if we say we just put in place the same process for everyone, like in this example, to ensure a fair selection, you all get the same test. You must all climb that tree. Might sound fair initially, but if we look into it in a bit more detail, we can see that it's probably pretty hard for the fish to climb the tree, or also for the elephant. So this is just an example that treating everyone the same is not necessarily fair. We need to take into account other contextual factors to create a fairer work environment. And this is important because fairness and the perception of fairness in projects is subjective. It depends on the context, on different factors which individuals experience in how they perceive fairness, and also how acute or relevant the fair treatment is to the specific individual. Again, as you can see here, the writing is probably a little bit small, but the smallest fish basically says there is no justice in the world. The middle one says there is some justice in the world, and the big one says the world is just. And we can somehow also translate that a little bit to our projects and project supply chains and the people and organizations we work with in projects. Whilst as a client, we might initially think everything's fine, it's just, or we don't really need to think about it. The organizations and the individuals we work with in the projects will have consciously or subconsciously perceptions of fairness about how they are treated, and that then has an impact on how they engage with the project. But when I talk about fairness and justice, what do I mean? So in general, we differentiate the fairness and justice into three different dimensions. The first one is distributive, and that's very much about the perception of fairness of distributions of resources between parties. And it's not only resources, it's also rewards. And in projects, that can, for example, also be time. So it is not just human resources, but resources in general. And rewards can be of financial or non-financial nature. And when it is about the distribution and the perception of fairness of distributions, it's very much about three principles: equity, equality, and need. So it is not just equality, giving everyone the same. It is about considering equality. It is an important factor, but then also equity. What have people contributed, and therefore what do they deserve as a reward or as a resource, and then also what do they need? And it is a balance between these three criteria. The second dimension is procedural justice. Procedural justice is about the perception of fairness of the procedures that are used for decision making. And this very much relates to criteria such as procedures need to be free of bias. Procedures need to be transparent. People need to be given a voice. So it is about how are decisions made. And the third dimension is interactional justice. And this is very much about the perception of fairness regarding the manner in which outcomes and procedures are communicated. So distributive and procedural is about distribution of resources, processes for decision making, and then interactional is about how do we communicate the outcomes from the other two, and how do we actually treat the people who we work with. And that is, for example, concerned with treating with respect, with dignity. How is information communicated? Is it in a timely manner? Do we have justification? What information do we share and when do we share it? So with this as kind of a little bit the background, we conducted a study which was kindly supported by the APM and contacted project managers and asked them to write a diary. So we asked them to record their perceptions of fairness, of fair or unfair treatment, which they experience in their working environment regularly in a diary, in a journal. And we did this over a 4 weeks period, and we asked them to do at least 3 diary entries per week. And this allowed us to really get timely information. Otherwise, when we conduct research, we often do interviews about events which are maybe 2 years in the past. So there is a bit of, recollection bias. There's just a bit of distance to what has happened. With this method, we collected really timely information and also the context within which it happened. And we then followed up on interviews and explored some of the events they shared with us in the diaries in a bit more depth. So we picked out some so-called critical incidences and discussed them in more detail where we needed a bit more information. So it was kind of a multi-method qualitative research design based on diaries and interviews. And what we found is that, as with general research which is established, that the perception of fairness and unfairness very much in projects very much relate to the distribution of resources and rewards. The really interesting thing was, particularly in connection to rewards, it was not so much about the money. It was very much about also non-financial rewards, which project managers received or didn't receive, which they perceived as fair or unfair treatment. And then it is about the policies, the procedures, processes, rules, regulations, standards, and systems which are in place in the project. So this also very much relates to the governance of the project and what is in place to facilitate a fair working environment. And the interpersonal treatment and informational exchange, as I mentioned earlier. Then I also mentioned earlier that there are some contextual factors which we need to take into account when people perceive fairness. And these are factors which influence their perceptions of fairness. So first is the source of the treatment. Where does it come from? Is it within the organization they work with, or is it in a different organization? For example, from the client organization, is it the client's representative? Is it someone from a different contractor, or is it their own line manager? And what we found there, that the treatment within the own organization where they are employed is perceived as more acute, but the treatment from external sources, but internal to the project, so other organizations which are involved in the project, does also matter. The temporality and frequency of the treatment also plays a role. So how often am I being treated fairly or unfairly? And I think that's pretty obvious. The more often you're treated unfairly, the more ingrained this becomes and the bigger an impact it has on the behavior of the individual, for example, the engagement with the project. But also the temporality. What we found is that individuals were more likely to tolerate a certain degree of unfairness in the context of the project compared to their own organization, because it is temporary. They kind of say, okay, I know I need to work with this person only for another 6 months. I can get through that. Whereas if this same treatment would come from their line manager, it would have a bigger impact because there is no end in sight. It's also the authority and the accountability which individuals hold, which plays a role in how they perceive fairness. The more, if they have authority and accountability, they typically had less issues with fair or unfair treatment. It was specifically more junior project managers which had accountability, but sometimes not the authority, which had really strong perceptions of unfairness. And also the adoption of reflective practices helped individuals to contextualize the fair or unfair working environment. And what is the impact? As I said earlier, the fair and unfair treatment has quite wide-reaching impacts. So firstly, that's on the individual, on the health and well-being of individuals, but also on their career progression, on their involvement in projects or in organizations where individuals decided to leave projects or organizations because they perceived the environment was so unfair that they cannot or do not want to work in that environment. Then it also has, just come back to the individual. We also know from previous studies that if individuals are treated fairly, they show an extra level of so-called organizational citizenship behavior or project citizenship behavior. So that means they put in the extra effort, which goes beyond their contractual agreement of what they would have to do. Because if they are treated fairly, they perceive that as engaging in a social exchange, and they want to return that. Then on the organization, we also know that it has an impact on the individual's own organization, also through how our deadlines met, how our contractual matters delivered for the project, which then has repercussions on the own organization. And then it also has an impact on the project. We can say that quite confidently, not only through this qualitative study, but we've also done two quantitative studies where we tested statistically the relationship between the presence of organizational justice and project performance. And we know from these results that the relationship is significant and that it is more likely that a project is successful if people are treated fairly. And to wrap up my presentation, there are a few recommendations which we would like to share with you. They are in much more detail in the report for which the link has been posted in the chat. So firstly, for individuals, it is really about being aware of the impact of actions on others in the project team and taking responsibility for creating a fairer work environment, because every single individual working in the project can contribute to that. Especially if you are in a leadership position, like project manager, client, you have even more responsibility to put in place the governance to allow for a fairer work environment. Then for organizations, it's very much about building the skills and capabilities of their employees to apply fairness in projects, to get to know what does it involve, what do we need to do. And for the profession, and APM is doing that also by giving us the opportunity to talk about it today, to really raising awareness in the community of the impact of fair or unfair treatment in projects. And I would just like to finish with this quote by Victor Hugo: "Being good is easy, what is difficult is being just." So it's not just about being good and giving everyone what they want. Being just can be difficult to put in place this work environment where people feel treated fairly. And here are my contact details, and that's all from my side. And I think we're going to engage in a bit of a discussion now, Gabriela.
Yes, thanks, Christine, for a very interesting presentation. I think that we should speak more about this topic in projects. So yes, I have a couple of follow-up questions. On some of them, you mentioned some, you already added a little bit, but I would just like to expand on this. So you mentioned that organizational justice is subjective. Could you please expand a little bit on this? And what does this mean for organizations or managers who want to adopt this?
Yeah, because this is often a question also I get. What does it mean if it's subjective? We basically can't do anything because everyone will perceive it differently. And if we dive a little bit deeper into this, we kind of need to look at it on two levels. One is organizational justice, so the justice aspect. And this really relates to the more objective measures which we can put in place. For example, the processes, the procedures which we can put in place, how are decisions made, how are resources allocated, how are awards allocated. And there are the so-called justice rules. They are also in the report. If you like to read up on them, they're really helpful to get a better understanding of what that means. And then we look at the perception of fairness. And this is when it becomes really subjective and in the eye of the beholder, because different people are in different circumstances. So if I have two project managers, one has a very big project, is already over workload and very busy. The other one has a smaller project and is only 50% busy. If as the boss give them a new project, which is 50% capacity, it will be perceived as very unfair by this person who is at full capacity if I give the project to them. But if I give the project to the person at 50% capacity, that's probably fine because they still have capacity. So it's not an action per se, which is fair or unfair. It's in the context of the individual and then on how they perceive it for it to be fair or unfair. And it is about having the processes in place, having the justice system in place to facilitate more transparency in decision making, etc., so that these contextual factors can also be taken into account.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I'm just checking the comments here, and we have one comment from Tom saying, interestingly, the sponsor executive often puts the project manager in a difficult position which is very difficult to implement with reference to a fair work environment. And he adds, this is one of the reasons we see high turnover in project manager roles. Any thoughts on that comment?
Yeah, I agree. The high turnover, it is probably one of the reasons. We had examples in our study where people explicitly said they left organizations and projects because of the unfair treatment. And this is also why we are saying in our recommendations, really everyone needs to take responsibility. And fairness is, and organizational justice is very much defined as the perception of justice from the treatment from an authority. So sponsors, executives have a particular relationship, responsibility here, because they put in place on how they then treat the project managers, for example, and how they then treat the project team members, the contractors. And there is unfortunately still very much this culture of being tough. If I admit, or if I aim to be just or to be fair, then it is equal with being good and being too nice and giving away. We've even heard in our studies the term, we can't afford to be just or to be fair. It costs too much. And this is a very common misconception of fairness and justice, because we would argue you can't afford not to be fair, because, as I said earlier, it is not about giving everyone what they want. It is about taking into account need, equity, and equality. And we know the negative effect it has on health and well-being, on turnover, on engagement. So if you say you can't afford to be fair, it's really about providing the education. What is fairness and why does it matter? And this is what we are trying to do.
Yeah, I think that's very insightful, and linking what you just said with Mohammed's comment on organizational justice is a far more complex subject in multicultural environments where a lot of societal factors influence. Yeah, any thoughts? I imagine it just adds a layer of complexity, not being able to.
Yes, I fully agree. It becomes a far more complex subject, and it is, as it is with so many of the topics predominantly studied so far in the Western context. We have some studies not conducted by me, but I'm aware of some studies in particularly one study in the Project Management Journal, which was conducted in the context of China. And I was also a co-author of a study in the context of Pakistan. So we are starting to get some more insights from other cultures, but yeah, it makes it much more complex if you consider it in a multicultural context.
Thank you. Another follow-up question for you is, in which aspects or life cycle stages of a project does fairness and justice play a role?
Yeah, throughout the project. And what we have found in a different study where we particularly looked at fairness in project governance is that, especially in the early stages, you can really make a difference, because this is very much where you set the tone and where you put in place your processes, procedures, your governance arrangements, where you assemble your team. And it is then also about demonstrating the fair treatment and then getting reciprocal action so that people actually pay you back, not in financial terms, but in terms of their engagement with the project. So it matters throughout the project life cycle, but it is particularly important at the beginning, because once the project is a bit on the wrong track in terms of fairness and how people are treated, it is much, much more difficult to turn it around. I wouldn't say it is impossible, but it makes it just much more difficult, and it takes more time and effort because it
Yes.
is also related to trust. So individuals use their perception of fairness or unfairness as a heuristic to judge if they can trust someone. And especially in projects where we are in more uncertain environments, we often work with new people who come on the project. We come onto new projects. It's not kind of the more stable environment of our permanent organizations we are employed in. We need these heuristics to determine, can we trust someone or not? And the perception of fairness is an important heuristic which we use as judgment. So if we get this wrong at the beginning, it is less likely that individuals working on the project will trust the project manager, the client, further down the line. And to rebuild trust is very hard.
Well, yeah, that's a very I mean, let's all write down these recommendations and thoughts. I think they are key to what you're aiming at in your study. Here, Edward, he's asking. You mentioned earlier about junior project managers feeling that there is more injustice in projects due to their lack of authority. What would you recommend junior project professionals in this scenario?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It is not only due to the lack of authority. They really perceive injustice if there is a lack of authority, but accountability. So and this happens quite often on more junior levels, that you're accountable to deliver something or to do something by a certain date, but you don't actually have the authority over other people to be able to be in a position to deliver it. So I think, again, this is something for the leadership to address, to be aware. If someone is accountable, we actually need to give them the authority to be able to deliver on their accountability. And for junior project professionals, I recommend to raise it. If they feel they are accountable for something that they are not in a position to deliver because of a lack of authority, it is about raising it. It is about engaging in the conversation to also make your leader, manager aware that there are constraints and what could be changed. So yeah, that would be my recommendation.
Thank you. So I was gonna ask, because my question was linked to what Fabienne is asking as well. Of course, it's the million-dollar question, but how can organizations create a system where employees receive fair treatment? I guess you already touched on this a little bit, but is there anything that you will highlight?
So it's not a quick fix. I can't just say you need to do this and this, and then it's
like a
done.
checklist, right?
Exactly. And this is what is often difficult, and this is why it is a journey. So I really recommend having a look at the justice rules in the report and trying to internalize those in the working practices, but also in the policies and in the procedures in the organization. And this will be a first step towards creating a fairer work environment. And a big part is also, as I said earlier, it's about the education, and it's about really becoming more aware of the role the fair treatment plays, and becoming more aware of what fairness actually means, because there are still a lot of misconceptions out there. Yeah, these would be my recommendations here.
Thank you. Something that I remember from your presentation was the non-financial rewards. Do you have any examples of these non-financial rewards, as they are turned out they were key in the study to any examples? Or
these can take all different forms. It can be being copied in an email which praises you to the line manager, for example, or if things like that. It can be a promotion. It can be receiving positive feedback. It can be. It really depends on the context. What were other examples? I think also it was about then getting, and that links a little bit to the resources, but getting additional resources or additional time to do something because as a reward for work and performance. So yeah, it was definitely relevant, but it depends very much on the context of what is appropriate as a reward. But it can be as little as feedback and
being acknowledged and
acknowledgement, exactly.
Supported. Feel like you can speak to your line manager. I think those little things are not so little in the end of the day, right?
Exactly. Yes.
We have another question here in the chat. So in industries that often demand tight deadlines and high pressure situations, how can project professionals balance the need for efficiency and productivity while ensuring the well-being and work-life balance of their team members to create a fair and sustainable work environment? I guess, I mean, adding, like, especially in industries with high pressure situations, tight deadlines, I think this just becomes a little bit more complex, maybe.
Yes, and I mean, this is a very, very far-reaching question, but very relevant. I don't think fairness can solve everything. I think it plays a very big role, but it can't solve everything. But when we talk about a fairer environment in such tight deadlines, high pressure situations, then it is about ensuring, and we talked about authority and accountability. If we have tight deadlines and high pressure, we need to make sure that people have the authority to deliver what they need to deliver. We need to make sure that the treatment of the individuals remains respectful. We continue to treat people with dignity. Often in these very towards the end of a project or when a milestone comes up, I know I've worked in industry, the tone can change in communications, in verbal as well as written communication. And this is why I said earlier that every individual needs to take responsibility, because even in these environments, we still need to make sure that we treat individuals with respect and with dignity. And when decisions are made, that we do not neglect, and I read in one comment earlier, it's about the listening culture. Yes, it's about giving people a voice who are involved in decision making. And we just really need to make sure that we do not forget these basic principles, even if we have deadlines, even if we have high pressure situations. Because if we justify the deadlines and the high pressure situations, or if we use these as a justification to treat people badly, we create this unsustainable environment. So especially in these situations, it is important to remember the principles of fairness, and then being aware that everyone working on the project is a human, and if they are treated unfairly, there will be consequences. and you also mentioned the term sustainable work environment, and under that I very much understand that it's that we continue to be able to contribute to our work environment, so that we are not put in a position to be burnt out, for example. And that again relates to distribution of resources. Do we actually have enough resources to deliver our outputs?
Yeah.
How are they allocated? So I think fairness can't solve this question which you posed, or fully solve this question which you posed, because it is almost like one of the million-dollar questions as well. But I do think that it can make a difference, and that it can contribute to a more sustainable work environment if we adopt more of these justice principles.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's not one correct answer for these questions. That, of course, especially when you say everyone has to be involved, and this is a process that goes through like every stage of the project, although it's particularly relevant in the beginning stages. So I think this your answer really responded a couple of comments. Obina's comment on what happens when you are running out of time to deliver our products. Tight deadlines, of course. People are reacting in the chat saying, the topic is quite interesting. And we have another comment from Tamlin. Let me see if we have already addressed this. As senior professionals, how can we proactively address unconscious biases to foster a truly equitable work environment, aligning with APM's Code of Professional Conduct? Yeah, biases, that's something really that should be addressed, right?
Yes, especially unconscious bias is difficult, and again needs the education and the development of kind of bringing it to a conscious level. I have to admit our work didn't specifically look into unconscious bias. So I'm a bit hesitant to answer that, because yes, I can say something from my general knowledge, but I can't really underpin it with the research we did. Again, I think, well, maybe I make a comment. It is about becoming aware also of the contexts individuals operate in, and this is the kind of the contextual nature of the perception of fairness, and trying to understand that, and maybe that can help to address some of the unconscious bias. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to bring that into the conversation, because what are we doing to address that? I mean, it's not part of your study, but I mean, I think this has to be someone has to talk about this in the room.
I agree.
So yes, we have a lot of comments. For those who are interested in the report, you can find this report on the research website at APM. This session is also going to be available on the LinkedIn, APM's LinkedIn, and so you can go back and review some of the questions we have made here today. I think we're running out of time, so maybe we will just take maybe a final question or closing comments. Let me check if we have any question that might not have been answered. Well, I think we have covered most of these questions so far. So thank you, everyone. Any final comments, Christine?
No, just thank you, everyone attending. It's great that there is the interest for this topic, and I hope that you maybe also become a bit of ambassadors for fairness in projects, so that we can spread the word a bit wider. And if everyone is interested in having a conversation or more details, please do feel free to get in touch. either via LinkedIn or via my university email address. Always happy to have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, for your time, and thank you, everyone here. Well, let's walk the talk and let's do something about this. So thanks, everybody, and have a nice rest of the day.